Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here with us today. We have some excellent programs coming up. On Sunday, January 27th, we'll be screening a documentary film at the Millerton Movie House, which will use personal stories to illustrate how the opioid epidemic is affecting the northwest corner of Connecticut. On Friday, April 12th, Richard Fuller will be speaking to us at the Salisbury School. He's the founder and president of Pure Earth. High concentrations of toxins have devastating health effects on more than 200 million people worldwide. Pure Earth works to identify and clean up the poorest communities throughout the developing world. So his talk should be one that should be of interest to everyone. If you or any of your friends miss any of our talks, please be aware that videos of them can be viewed on our website, usually within a few days after the talks. We're very happy to have Chris Estes as our speaker this evening. After getting a master's degree in social work, Chris worked in a family resource center in a low-income community. His experience there underscored the repercussions of poverty on families and communities. He then pursued a second master's degree in city and regional planning, focusing on the impact of public policy on a national, regional, and local level. Subsequent jobs have given him an in-depth understanding of the relationship between housing, transportation, community development, education, and public health. While working in the field, Chris attended the Kennedy School of Public Policy at Harvard for state and local leaders, served on the board of directors with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and is currently serving on the board of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. He's dedicated much of his career to helping people and communities find solutions to their housing problems. We're very fortunate to have him with us tonight, so please join me in giving Chris Estes a warm welcome.
All right. You guys hear me all right? Yeah. All right. Good evening. I'll try that again. Good evening. Good evening. There we go. For those of you who aren't related to me somehow, who are here, I actually grew up in communities very similar to this, spending my life as a faculty child at several different boarding schools. But I also spent a fair amount of my time in the South, and when you spend time working in North Carolina, you learn the call and response world. So I got very used to doing that and expecting to hear a reply until I had my first presentation in New York City, where I said, "Good afternoon," and no one said a word, and I was like, wow, welcome to the big city. So anyway, I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank Mary and the Forum Board for having me, and Hotchkiss for hosting me. And I particularly want to thank Mary for her passion and support for this issue. She really has done excellent work bringing this issue to a forefront and encouraging many of you to get involved. What I wanted to talk with you tonight about is a little bit about the history behind the affordable housing movement, how we got here, in a sense, to the situation we're in nationally and where we are today, and then focus at the end a little bit about what about right here in the community that you all live in. So my current employer requires me to give you a little quick presentation of the work I do right now, which is with a national organization called Rebuilding Together that does emergency home repair and community revitalization work in low-income communities across the country. Our work is really a part of a broader effort to both revitalize communities that have been in decline and disinvestment and do preservation work for communities in high-cost areas to keep folks from being pushed out. We have about 130 affiliates across the country. I've been in this work for about a year, which has been very interesting and exciting to be a part of. But in my previous work, I spent about 14 years doing housing policy and community development policy work at both the state and federal level. And in that work, work two slides here. In that work, I had tried to think of how to help people understand how housing connects to issues that they think more about. And so the first slide I created back in 2004 in a very early version of PowerPoint looked something like this. And it was about housing was kind of the hub of a wheel, and it was interconnected and interdependent on a lot of the issues that we spend more time thinking about or even trying to solve. What you live in and where you live essentially determines where you go to school and the quality of education that your children have access to. The safety and well-being of your home certainly influences your public health. The issues of older adults and whether their ability to age in place or what housing options they have after they no longer can live independently are particularly influenced by housing. Their access to services and supports they need. Persons with disabilities are also extremely influenced by housing, and in fact, one of the challenges for that field is that most of the field that serves persons with disabilities spends a lot of time thinking about services and supports, and yet struggles to figure out how do we find places for folks to live since we have moved past deinstitutionalization. Open space in the environment. A lot of folks who care a lot about preserving open space have sometimes struggled to understand that if we aren't providing enough housing that's affordable to workforces and low to moderate income populations, that housing gets built further and further away from city centers where land is cheap, and that sprawl, in a sense, makes it much more difficult to preserve the open and green space that we value. Transportation may be less of an issue in a community like this, but certainly in most population centers, people's ability to live and afford to live close to where they work or where they need to go for services has huge impacts on transportation. I live in Washington, D.C. right now, which is probably the city that has the worst traffic in the country. I am lucky enough to afford to live in a place where I actually bike to work. But we made a huge trade-off to choose to live in a place that was more expensive so that we would not have to be in that traffic, not a choice that everybody gets to make. And then finally, economic development, and I'll spend more time talking about this at the end, which is really about what's the future of your community, not just now, but where will it be, because communities are always changing. And particularly for a community like this that has a high quality of life, but essentially no middle class, it's a real question that I think housing is at the centerpiece for your discussion. So let me start a little bit with how we got here. So the housing movement really begins with Jane Addams and Hull House work in Chicago. She's really the mother of social work in lots of ways, and a pretty amazing figure given that the time period that she's launching this work is 1889. So we are in the throes of the end of the Reconstruction period from the Civil War, essentially. And her work was really about the overcrowding in cities, the ability to provide opportunities for women, but doing a lot of work with immigrant communities and essentially focusing on community development as a solution. What was exceptional about her work was as a college-educated woman in 1889, which was a rarity unto itself, she was able to get control of property, get funding, and create programs that served women and immigrant families on a whole comprehensive set of issues. One of her acolytes was Mary Sienkiewicz. She was a friend of hers and another exceptional woman who grew up in Chestnut Hill, Mass., went to Radcliffe College and Columbia, and actually studied in Berlin, and then started her own movement of a settlement house in New York City. She got very interested in housing and really became the founder of the affordable housing movement, forming a coalition of folks that became known as the Public Housing Coalition, before public housing was a housing type, but really arguing for housing to be publicly supported and controlled. And at the beginning of the Great Depression in 1931, she brought a group of all white men who were developers, lenders, realtors, construction folks who were struggling to build and survive in the Great Depression, and formed what became the National Housing Conference. It started in New York City with the first investments in housing in 1931, and then they moved on to Washington, D.C., where that organization became the National Housing Conference. That organization I would later head 80 years later. And so I like to think of my career as being connected to both of these women from my pursuit in social work and affordable housing. I think what was amazing was how ahead of their time they were and how their work had such long-lasting impact. So when you think about where we are in this moment of the 30s, we think about Roosevelt's New Deal, which is one of the first points that sort of calls attention to housing issues. But there was also sort of intense segregation that was both current in the country with the backlash to Reconstruction that had been happening in the late 1800s, but was for the first time one of the signature housing achievements was the Federal Housing Administration. We actually institutionalized segregation in our country. So when you think of discrimination and segregation, you often think of excuse me, did I go in the, I keep moving too slow. We think of signs like this. These were mostly common in the South, in the southern states, around drinking fountains and bathrooms. But there were other signs that maybe don't show up in movies that were much more explicit about the level of discrimination that people were experiencing. I put these up for two reasons. One, to show what was happening, what was legally happening in the country at the time, but I also think they have some relevance in today's discussion about the narrative about how we treat each other and sort of take views towards non-white populations in this country. Both of these were, in a sense, I found on Restaurant Association websites from their history. So what you don't always think of is things that look like this. And I apologize for the blurriness, but this is I'll show you a clearer one in a second, but these are redlining maps that were instituted by the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s, where banks and the government got together and drew lines to decide where they were going to allow banks to invest and where those loans would be publicly secured and backed and where they would not. And in each case of the maps I'm going to show you, those darker colors are where African American and communities of color were located, and those were considered off limits in the sense that you could lend there, but you'd have no financial support to do so. So even we would assume cities in the South, Selma, Alabama, Atlanta, the sort of places where the civil rights movement was famously taking place. But these were happening in cities all over the country in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And they're encapsulated in this book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law. And if you're interested in this topic as a historian or somebody who cares about civil rights, I really encourage you to read it. It's one of the toughest reads you'll go through because it really calls out. It's done by a law professor, not in a political way, not in a kind of advocacy way, but really as a law professor saying what were the legal actions that cities and towns were taking to actively discriminate about where people could live. And it's, I think, a part of our history we try to forget about. But when you look at where we are today and where areas of concentrated poverty are and the situation with unequal wealth by race, it's rooted in this very formalized and very systemic levels of discrimination. So this is Denver, Colorado. Again, places that you wouldn't necessarily think of, but clearly delineated where investment would occur. And what's amazing is when you go to these cities today, you know where you will find the African American communities in these cities. This is the progressive city of Seattle, which, again, I apologize for the blurriness, but clearly did the same thing. And this is a city closer to home of Hartford, Connecticut. Now, I mentioned my father taught at boarding school. He taught at Loomis Chaffee, not far from Hartford. And I went to school there as well. And you can see the green is where West Hartford is. So it's no secret that the kids I went to school with, more of them came from West Hartford than from that red and yellow areas down near the center of the city. What I think is also exceptional about this map is that it's not referred to as a map in a lending sense. Its title is a residential security map. So it was basically saying this is where it's safe to lend. And the first grade, or the highest amount of safety, was determined to be where the green areas were. The fourth grade was the dark red and maroon levels. So those were the most unsafe. And again, this is kind of a hidden part of our history. We're much more comfortable with the ideas of the colored drinking fountains that came down in the Civil Rights Act passage that ended formal discrimination. But these land use maps persisted well past that kind of legislation. And it took until the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, for these land use maps to be formally confronted and made illegal. So think about that period of American history and how much wealth was created through programs like the GI Bill coming out of World War II, when the vast majority of white Americans became homeowners for the first time, and we moved from a nation of renters to a nation of homeowners. How different that was for communities of color, and how we think about some of the social issues and wealth creation issues of today were legislated into that period. So a little bit about these 2 points in history where we really looked at housing. So we created a lot of important housing investments in the 30s that I mentioned, but again, on a very segregated access basis. Public housing was created as housing for white folks, particularly after the war, when we had a shortage of housing units for soldiers coming back. And that housing was actually set up to be mixed income. So the design was that people of different income levels would work there and live there, and they would be able to, their mix of incomes would support a variety of different rents, and that would support the operation of the building. Well, when white flight began to occur and African-American families and low-income families in general came to public housing as a housing of last resort, that varied income model failed, and the buildings fell into disrepair and basically stayed in disrepair throughout the length of their operation, with the backlog really occurring significantly in the 70s, which I'll talk about in a second. So the next great and I would note that the attention on rural was, for the first time in the 30s, really happened more because of the Dust Bowl, the loss of farmland, the attention of how do we support farmers, and areas like this, which were heavily farming communities in their day, were thought about much more about, is there viable options to support people's homeownership opportunities in rural communities in the 30s, again, on a very segregated basis. So later in the 60s, we had a kind of revisiting of poverty and housing issues under the Kennedy and Johnson's Great Society programs. And I mentioned the Fair Housing Act was passed in '68, which was the first time that we really began to deal with access to lending. Still heavily challenged to be enforced. Public housing had a very different role in that period, very well intentioned, but ended up was essentially built to keep folks in rather than to have them connected to their community. So a lot of the design that you saw in that period was very concentrated but very inward looking, and created a lot of concentrated poverty issues. And it led to the creation of the HUD and the Housing and Urban Development Program. So where are we today? And I have this, and again, I hope this map would be a little clearer, but you can see Litchfield County is up where in the top left. This map shows Connecticut towns that have more than 10% of their housing that's affordable to folks at below area median income. So you can see the challenge is not just one for this county, but Connecticut as a whole has one of the bigger affordable housing challenges, and state leaders and business leaders have been working for over a decade trying to think of ways to increase the supply because they saw the challenge of being able to recruit industry and hold on to families, in particular professional folks who were leaving the state because of the high cost of housing. We have a limited number of programs. Right now, there's really only one national rental program that I talked with Mary's group about, the low-income housing tax credit that produces affordable multifamily units, generally on a higher scale. So you would see like at a minimum of like 24 units for a development in a rural area and typically 50 to 100 in an urban area, but not enough production. We do like 2 million units of that a year, and the shortage is, or 2,000 units a year, and the shortage is in the hundreds of thousands. We do have some limited homeownership guarantee programs, but the challenges that we're seeing right now across the country are really related to access to land and land costs, especially in desirable areas with high quality of life, and that includes communities like this. In urban areas, the debate is around the ability to build at greater density and create more flexible uses, and I'll talk a little bit about that in this urban-rural area. So often people get locked into, we want only single-family housing, we want only this level of density because that's what we know, and then we say, but we also know we have an affordability problem. We don't have enough supply. No one's building new housing. Why is that? And that's, I think we have directly recreated our problem there. So when we think about shifting to Salisbury or the Salisbury-Lakeville area or the region around us that includes several communities, I think the most important place to start is to think about how we are stewards for both the now and the future. You are all stewards of your community, and communities are never static. You are always declining or increasing in some way. You're either maybe becoming more desirable for older adults to come here because there's a high quality of life, really cute boutique stores in lots of places, nice places to eat. Or we could be declining because in the desirability of families with children, because housing's expensive, the jobs that are available for people who aren't already wealthy or retired are fairly low wage. I would argue that probably this area gets most of its service workforce through the large number of substance abuse recovery centers in this area that provide a population of folks who need to work and are willing to work in those jobs, and that's an important tool. But that may not be your best long-term strategy for a balanced population that will be sustainable into the future. So any discussion that you're going to have about affordable housing has to be a broad one and has to be thinking about not what's in it for us today, but what kind of town, what kind of legacy do I want to leave 10 years or 20 years from now? Will this still be a great place to live? And you can look at communities that became early retirement communities like Florida to see what can happen when communities become, in a sense, obsessed with protecting what they have now. A lot of those communities were very hostile to initiatives to bring families with children in because they saw schools as driving up their taxes, and they were happy with what they had. And then when the service sector that was set up to serve them had a harder and harder time recruiting workers, and a lot of those businesses would leave because they couldn't pay the wages that people needed to earn to drive 2 or 3 counties away. They then said, how do we fix this? And it's much harder to solve that problem once you've gone into a crisis than if you can be a little proactive ahead and thinking, what is the best sustainable mix for us? How do we have a community that people of a range of incomes are going to want to live in, not just in Salisbury or Lakeville, but the region itself going to the future? So to do that, you really need to think of using a little asset-based social work frame. What are the assets? What draws people here? Why would somebody want to live here in different stages of life. And then what are the challenges for those folks? And you think about some of the assets you have in this area, like a hospital, and then you think, what happens if the hospital's maternity ward closes? Well, does that make it more likely or less likely that families with young children or young families who might start a family would live here? And I know thinking about the hospital that's here is very similar to the hospital that I was born, my sister and I were born in Greenfield, Massachusetts, outside of Northfield, Mount Hermon. And I would think that my parents would have probably made some different decisions about whether that was a place they wanted to stay when it came time to have children, if that hospital didn't have a maternity, the ability, a birthing center for women to have to go through childbirth. So you think about all those elements of what they mean down the road and how that creates, it can continue to tip things in one direction or the other. A lot of communities look at retail as an economic development strategy, and that can be great. But are there abilities for people to come and start businesses, to become entrepreneurs? What is the, beyond a restaurant and a boutique store, the ability for businesses to start here and be successful that could lead to greater employment? You think about how housings fit into the issues like healthcare. Where are those healthcare workers going to live, and will they want to work in this area if the schools are closing or if there aren't access to housing that they can afford? What is the environment like? A lot of communities similar to this think about how the environment becomes an economic driver for growth. Ecotourism, you have the Appalachian Trail going through here, you have lakes. A lot of wooded protected areas and parks can be a very desirable place for people to live and want to come here to experience, and that can trigger a lot of economic development in ways where people begin to start businesses, whether it's related to hiking or the outdoors. Much of eastern North Carolina, where in the state where I used to live before I came to D.C., was going through this as they lost their manufacturing jobs and had to figure out, well, the one asset we have is a river. How do we use that? Our mentality has been to just sort of exploit our natural resources, but we could actually become a place people want to live and where businesses can thrive because they can take advantage of that. Again, small business development. The debate about whether to have high-speed internet has a lot to do with what kind of entrepreneurial environment you have for people to want to start businesses. And again, this is not a place that I can imagine, and again, I know it a little bit, but not as well as you do, that where a lot of new manufacturing jobs are likely to come, another plant of some side. But in the tech sector and the people's ability to come up with jobs and businesses, having that high-speed internet and an environment that is nurturing and supportive of entrepreneurship can create a desirable community for people in their 20s and 30s to come to experience the high quality of life that you enjoy, but also be able to start that business in an environment that maybe offers different benefits than an urban environment has and challenges. And then finally, arts and culture. I mean, why do people want to live here? One of the reasons is that there are, for the size of the communities that there are a tremendous number of arts and cultural events, including the events that happen on the two prep school campuses of Salisbury and Hotchkiss. It's kind of like having a college town environment in many ways, and those can be great drivers for folks to want to be here. The challenge of all these assets that you have is that if they are seen as exclusive, in other words, we have all these things and I really don't want it to change, that's not a great predictor of the future, because what happens after you're gone? Will the next generation want to continue to come? Is it sustainable that the only population that moves in is over 60? And I would say my wife and I always enjoy coming here. We live in D.C., which is one of the younger cities where I am constantly the oldest person in every restaurant and bar we go into. And we come in here and we sort of feel like we're on the younger side again, which is an enjoyable experience. But again, and it's fun to be in a community where you feel connected at 50, 60, 70 years old. but probably not the healthiest long-term environment if there are no people younger. I wouldn't think that that's an environment that's going to do well economically for a long time. So, some ideas to think about. The different ways to increase the supply of housing in your communities have a lot to do with sort of two factors. How flexible is it for people to create additional units without major construction? So things like accessory dwelling units, which are basement apartments, garage apartments, granny flats. These amazingly are zoned out in many communities across the country, even large and small. In Raleigh, which is the capital of North Carolina, where we used to live, these were, you had to actually make these, go through a zoning process to do this, even though the city clearly needed more units, and is a great way to add a lot of affordable rental units to support workers in your community without major construction costs. Focusing on any and all publicly controlled land and how you utilize that to solve housing is vital. Land's the most expensive and the most difficult to access at an affordable level for developers to build housing. So usually the public land is the piece that you can do the most work with. How can you put out a proposal and ask developers, here's what we want. We either are looking for more homeownership opportunities or more affordable rental opportunities. I would advocate in particular for you all to think about how you do affordable homeownership for the long term. Community land trusts are ways in which the land is owned by a nonprofit and the owner owns the house. And so your ownership, if I own that house, appreciates over time, and when I sell, I will get some equity for that. But my equity will be less than if I owned the land as a whole. But the return on it for the community is that that housing stock essentially is rising in value as incomes rise and inflation, but it stays affordable for the next generation. Many communities have gone to this strategy because they saw their initial investment in the college town of Chapel Hill, where I went to college. They built about 80 affordable homes over a 10-year period, and all of those were lost after the owner sold, because the desirability of that community was so high that even though it started out as a lower price point and the homes weren't very big, after 7 or 8 years, people were willing to pay $300,000 for that house, and then it was $500,000, and then it was $700,000. And so they realized if we want to have a supply of homes that can, where our medium income workforce can live, we need to make them permanently affordable. And so now every affordable unit that's built in that county is in a community land trust, and it can be scattered throughout the community. And every new development is required to put a percentage of their units in the land trust to ensure that there's some supply going forward in the long run. I think one of the things that's important is to think regionally. I know New England is especially parochial, but all of us, in a sense, if you think about Litchfield as a county, there's a very similar sense of interconnectedness of what happens in one place influences the other, and how we think about the housing needs of that of the region, what our current housing stock looks like, what are the incomes, who's growing, who's declining, are schools growing and declining, where are the demographics trended, and what's happening with employment. Are people having difficulty finding workers, and what parts of the county are they struggling to have difficulty? That conversation needs to be comprehensive because political will is central to the success of trying to solve these issues. You need a group of well-intentioned, well-meaning folks to push the issue, but unless the larger public is involved and people can kind of see what's in it for them, it's very difficult to move the needle far. And that's no different if you're in Salisbury, Connecticut, or if you're in Hartford, Connecticut, or if you're in New York City. That idea of sort of how it affects people is central. So what I want to close with is this idea of, okay, I'm assuming most of you who, again, weren't required to come because you're related to me, came because you're interested in this issue. And I'm hopeful that most of you are supportive of the issue. Maybe a few of you came to find out what this other group is talking about that you think is bad and you want to know what the secrets are. But I'm hoping most of you are in the choir. So how do you talk about it with folks? And so I wanted to leave some ideas of, we spent a lot of time in the field over the last 15 years thinking about why we haven't, given that housing challenges have been so significant in this country for over 40 years, why this issue hasn't moved the needle publicly. And we realized that we were part of the problem. We had approached it from this idea of, if you just knew how bad the problem was, you would be as passionate about it as I was. And so we would overwhelm you with data and statistics about how big the need is, how many people couldn't afford stuff, how many families were struggling. And all that stuff is important, and people need to know it's real. But generally, when that's what you lead with and it dominates your message to folks, it tends to say, well, that's not me. And two, that sounds like the problem's really big and you're not going to fix it. So I'm not really motivated to get excited about it. And I would add that this really applies to when you're trying to talk to other members of the public, or if you're an advocate trying to talk to members of the public. When you're talking to elected officials, it's a little different. They want data is more acceptable. So we understood this, had exposure to this author named George Lakoff, who wrote a really important book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And he's a linguist from UC Berkeley. And we brought him to North Carolina for a bunch of organizations that were trying to change public policy on a whole variety of issues: environment, social justice, domestic violence, housing, education, health. And what we realized was that we were all struggling with this frame of, if one position is less government is good, your position can't be more government is better, because that's not an appealing position. And so we spent all this time saying, here's how bad everything is. And what people were hearing is, that sounds bad and your solutions sound bad, because the words you're using were triggering very negative images. And what Lakoff taught us was that people think and process information in what he called frames, and that frames were really useful for humans to survive and adapt. So if you had some image that you had either been taught or had seen, and you knew that that image was dangerous, if you saw something that was similar to that, you knew to stay away. Now, frames also have negative consequences in that they can reinforce negative stereotypes. So when you think about the issues associated with the words affordable housing, do you think about the building on the left, or the building below, or the building on the right? And I would say the building on the bottom there is actually affordable development in Kent, Connecticut, which some of you may know as well. But where I learned this information, I worked for a nonprofit that was building affordable housing, and we were trying to do an affordable senior development in Cary, North Carolina, which is a bedroom community, big IBM place, no history of big public housing, kind of a rural, very suburban. And when the neighbors found out we were building an affordable apartments for seniors, by the way, they circulated pictures of Cabrini Green in Chicago. And I was stunned by that. And I thought, by the laughter, I think most of you have heard of Cabrini Green, one of the more infamous public housing developments in Chicago, those huge towers that were faced inward that concentrated a lot of poverty and were torn down not too long ago. But what it taught us was that when they heard the words affordable housing, the frame that they had was Cabrini Green. And these folks didn't live in Chicago. There was no housing like that in the state of North Carolina, but it was a powerful frame that they had absorbed through the media. And it said, this is dangerous, don't do it. Now, once we built the development, it looked very much like the building on the right there. And many people came to the opening and said, I had no idea this was what you were talking about. This looks great. And now it's a really valuable part of the community. And we built a multifamily development next to it, and it's been very successful. But it was this triggered stereotype that we really had to understand. So The other mistake that we make a lot of times is that we know that there's a negative stereotype, and so we say, I'm going to confront that head on, and I'm going to say, a lot of people say folks who can't afford housing, the problem is they're lazy, they don't want to work hard enough, and we shouldn't give them housing that's cheaper because that's an incentive for them not to work as hard. But I'm here to tell you that I've worked with these folks and I see how hard they work, and they want the same thing you and I want, and they deserve an opportunity to have a successful life and raise their kids in a safe, decent place. So I think I've done a good job, but what you heard was the first part of that message, which if you had a negative view of affordable housing or low-income people, you locked on to that, and you didn't hear anything I said after that. And we do that all the time when we try to make arguments in support of things. We think, well, I know what the opposition is, so I'm going to state that, and then I'm going to refute it. Really common problem. People do it a lot, not so much in writing, but a lot in conversation. So what we learned, and then the third mistake, is that we overuse statistics. And particularly we use statistics in a way, and this is what advocates are really bad at. If you work in housing, you spend a lot of time with acronyms and percentages. If I told you that 50% of the people who are at the 50% of the area median income pay 50% of their income for housing, does that really make sense? Now, if you're a houser, you get it, but it's way too much stats, and what most Americans don't actually understand percentages. But if I say half of the people who are renting in your community who make less than the average income pay half of their income for housing, that probably sounds a little clearer, but I have to drill it down even further. And so what we tell folks is, the place to start your argument and your communication is, what's a central value that you have? Why do you care about this issue? Why do you care about the people who are struggling to find housing? What's a value you think that brings your community together? I need to reach you on a value first before I get into data, before I get into solutions. And politically, what we learned was the Republicans were much better at this than Democrats were. And so we spent a lot of times learning, how were Republicans making really successful arguments about issues, and they were leading with values. And they were connecting with audiences. And Democrats are really good at coming up with a long list of things that needed to get done to be fixed. We need to do this 10-point, I got a 19-point plan to fix the economy, or fix the environment, versus I really believe that you're working incredibly hard, and we value that, and I'm going to figure out a way to make sure that your hard work pays off for you. Or we think the opportunity to be successful is the most important thing that makes this country great. And so we realized that we needed to make values like opportunity or fairness or the concept of interconnectedness, like understanding it takes a village, or we're a community and we're all in this together, and what we do affects each other. That needs to be part of that opening message. And I think some of the things that Mary did that I saw a couple years ago were really excellent at that. It was featuring people who worked in the community in jobs that were valuable, that we all knew we needed. And these were real folks with real lives, and we could see how we were connected together. And so it really started there, and then it's much easier to talk about why you should care about whether there's enough housing for them, or housing they can afford, or whether they can live in the community where you work, because you want those folks there. Then you can think about 1 or 2 data points to support your issue, and 1 or 2 solutions that can be implemented. Not an 8-point plan, not a 9-point plan, but it can help support this zoning change that allow people to build housing that can be more affordable in this particular part of town, or the ability to have accessory dwelling units so that people can modify their homes to take on a renter or 2. Or that we want to set up a community land trust to create long-term affordability, and it can be scattered throughout the region, but it's going to be the thing that makes sure that the investments we make today will still be here tomorrow and for the next generation. Most importantly, your message has to convey to the listener what's in it for me. And that's not in a self-serving way, but I think, again, more into that interconnectedness way. Because if people don't see themselves in your message and in your solutions, they're much less likely to get passionate and excited and supportive of them. So with that, I'm going to stop because I've gone on for a little while, and I'm going to take questions from the audience. And Mary, and I think we've got one other person with microphones who are going to go up and down the aisle. And if there's anything that I've talked about that you want to get more info on, or if there's something I didn't talk about, happy to do that. I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Is that right?
And I would just, hopefully this is on, just ask everyone to please stick to questions and don't make speeches. So does anyone have a question that they would like to ask?
Yes, we always say ask your question not in the form of a statement.
Chris, I wanted to hear just a little bit about the work that you're doing. I mean, this has been very helpful to relate this to our, local situation, but it'd be interesting to hear what
with Rebuilding Together in particular?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So Rebuilding Together is an interesting organization. Probably the best parallel I usually make for folks is it's essentially the Habitat for Humanity model for home repair. So it was founded about 30 years ago, very much on a small grassroots organization philosophy of bringing a bunch of well-intentioned folks with some resources together to find other volunteers and raise money to do home repair for folks so they could stay living safe in their homes. Over the first 20 years, the organization grew pretty quickly, spread out. At one point, there were over 250 affiliates across the country. It didn't invest enough in the organizational capacity building, so a lot of those affiliates began to burn out as people aged out of them. And I joined the organization about a year ago to really help them think about how we can create more sustainable models for the affiliates to survive. But we've adapted 25-point safe and healthy housing principles to really kind of improve the quality of work. So we think a lot about how do you assess people's homes to identify hazards, what's unsafe, how do you fix it in a way that is sustainable for the long term. And we're particularly focused on older adults who often own homes and can't afford to repair them. So a lot of it's about aging in place. How do you reduce falls, for example? We're doing some interesting pilot work with a healthcare firm called Anthem in North Carolina and Louisiana to track where we do home repairs and for whom their clients essentially, and we can track their consumption of healthcare to see how home repairs have reduced the healthcare costs that those folks would incur. Because one fall where someone's injured can be a significant healthcare cost, and multiple falls even more so. We do a lot of work in disaster recovery, particularly in the hurricane settings, because often people don't have flood insurance, low-income folks, and so they can get some money but usually can't get their homes fully repaired, and so those are the folks we target in particular. We have done a lot of work, particularly in urban centers, to think about how we can be part of the comprehensive revitalization of neighborhoods. So focusing on particular neighborhoods rather than scattered site to think how we bring this community back with other folks. We still use a lot of volunteers in our work, but more and more we use skilled labor. We just had a big event in New Orleans. It was technically in October, and I'm here to tell you that October in New Orleans is not fall. It was about 90 and humid, as hot a day as I can remember, but we had a great day of working on like 10 different homes in one particular neighborhood that was part of this Build a Healthy Neighborhood event in partnership with Lowe's. And it was great to personally get to go down and work and scrape and paint houses and build fences and do things. So there's a lot of work on the outside of a house, but we do a lot more work on the inside, particularly fixing electrical systems and stairs and doorways and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting organization to be a part of, and one that's in a lot of change right now, where that was sort of appealing to me to work at. And we are really developing sort of a business model so that as new affiliates are launched, they'll be much better prepared to be successful and sustainable for the long haul. So I hope that, if you have more specific questions, happy to. He's got the mic right behind you.
I spent some time in Sausalito with a friend, and you know, it's a beautiful part of the world, and it's got wonderful waterfront, and there were thousands and thousands of leaky old boats that were either sinking or had sunk or were on the verge of it, and there became a homesteading movement, a big one. And they rehabbed these things and put them back to where they were habitable, and they could get a C of O, and people wanted to live there. And so the next step, I don't have to tell you, but I'm sure you're aware, is that all of a sudden developers came rushing in and trying to condemn stuff and buy it, or buy it at market and then goose up the prices. Well, this is a real crisis. Now, how, if you do something like rebuilding together and you revitalize a community, how can the people of good conscience who are involved in that also prevent or, you know, avert that kind of land grab mentality that is based on the profit margin?
Sure, that's a great question. So we were having some of the students from Hotchkiss are here who we had dinner with before, and we were having this discussion about gentrification and displacement. And gentrification is probably one of the most misused, misunderstood words in this debate right now, because generally what we want to see for low-income communities is we want them to gentrify. We want them to be more desirable to live in. We want them to be safer, to have grocery stores, to have more amenities, to have better schools. What we don't want is displacement. What we don't want is for the people who were there before to not get to take advantage of that. So it takes a couple elements to do well. One, you have to be really organized with the existing folks so that they can help determine the path forward for their community. So if you're wanting to invest, I'm thinking about our affiliate does some work in Pittsburgh in a couple specific neighborhoods, and they target neighborhoods that are not in the worst shape, not the places that no one wants to live in with huge vacancy, but places that are seeing some improvement, and they say, if we work with these folks in combination with other organizations, we can trigger an environment where the market will want to come in and invest as well, and that can really, the market is always going to be more powerful than what we can do, and so that can really create this community to be desirable. Now in Pittsburgh, they're in a safer place than, say, Washington, D.C., where it spent a lot of time trying to create that desirable community, and then when it flipped and it suddenly the market took over, they weren't prepared to handle that. They didn't build the infrastructure of citizens really being a part of that and understanding what it meant to become more successful, more desirable place, what a grocery store would do, what it would mean to have higher performing schools or safer streets. And so you have to have folks really engaged to understand what these changes will bring. And then how do you want to preserve the affordability that's there? Either the existing homes, in this case, the homes that already people have. And so that's where a lot of land trust conversations come in. If you want these homes to stay affordable for the long run, you need folks to think about that. I did some work in graduate school in a lot of the places I worked in North Carolina were fascinating because they were African-American communities that had been founded by freed slaves. So they went all the way back to 1865. And these had been, again, they were segregated. They didn't have paved streets at first, and they were really locked out of the towns and communities. They're often in the river bottom land that would flood. But as they eventually became, if they buffered a community that would grow into them, they would face this gentrification pressure. And the conversations to say, here's what's coming, here's what you have to do to preserve this are really fraught and difficult. And a lot of people say, well, I don't want to give up this windfall I'm going to get because I can sell out to the developer and I'm going to make a lot of money. But then when you say what will happen, and what I was, as a fairly naive graduate student, saying, this is no longer going to become a historic African American community. It's going to become a student ghetto, essentially, where all the homes will be bought by developers and every bedroom will have 2 students in it. And once you get enough of those, then no homeowner wants to live next to 6 college students, and everybody sells. And even the ministers of the church were like, no, this sounds like you're trying to take something from us. And eventually it flipped. And it was very sad. The community has to really understand and engage in places where race is involved and the history of racism. It can be very difficult to do. But what we see happen is when communities can engage in that planning and you can think about tools to prevent displacement, which usually includes some new affordable investment, you can protect them from having that. But it's hard because it takes a very proactive conversation and a very real community organizing kind of conversation. People have to see themselves in it and understand that legacy that they want to be a part of. Do you want your kids to be able to live here or not? Is a conversation. And Portland, for example, has had they've had such rapid gentrification, and everyone has been bemoaning it. But then when I would go to meetings there and talk to folks, I'd say, well, you know what you have to do. You've got to think about how you're going to give something up to make sure this stays affordable going forward. And everybody's like, no, not that. Like, I don't want anything to change. And I was like, the market is coming, and you can't stop it. And so the only thing you can do is figure out what can you control to make sure your community is going to change anyway, but do you want to be able to be a part of it, or are you just going to cash out and go somewhere else? And so that's the conversations that particularly in our high-cost cities where our affiliates work, the Bay Area affiliates all up and down the peninsula, Seattle, Portland, for example, that's really the focus of their work, is all about preservation. Very different for the affiliates in Pittsburgh or Cleveland or places like that, where they're trying to get people to want to come to those communities and invest in these empty houses, essentially. And so we're trying to fix up a homeowner's house, hoping that the person's going to take that empty lot or that empty home next to them and want to buy it. So it's very different. I know it's a really long answer to your question, but it is a really important issue. And it's something that, you think about. We were talking at dinner, growing up in Connecticut, I could have never imagined that New Haven, Connecticut would be the most gentrified city in Connecticut. It just wasn't. When you went there, you thought about great pizza and how do I not get robbed? And Yale was trying to figure out how do we recruit students who only want to be inside the walls. And Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, had the same problem. And now it's who can afford to live in New Haven? It's the coolest, hippest place in Connecticut. And that's great for a lot of folks, but you talk to the people who work in all those service sector jobs who can't afford to stay there, they're pretty upset and they're frustrated that more wasn't done to help them stay a part of it. Sorry, I get wound up on that stuff and then talk too long. Oh, sorry. So community land trusts, more affordable housing built, more multifamily housing built up front before you, more requirements on developers coming in to have an affordable quotient as part of their new development because you've got demand coming, so inclusionary developments are really the basic things. You think about community benefit agreements when there's public investment, so if you're adding some sort of light rail or public transportation or some sort of public facility like a theater or a sports stadium, how do you get community benefits that either it's around jobs or additional affordable housing investments? So anything that's going to make the community more desirable, you try to quantify with an additional affordability requirement that's long-term, permanent, affordable. Those are the strategies. Okay, we got one back here.
A recent edition of the Lakeville Journal had an article about how Habitat for Humanity was only able to get one applicant for their new home in town. Today's Lakeville Journal has an ad for a two-bedroom apartment for $800. My question is the problem really the lack of housing, or is the problem really the lack of government subsidies for people who are trying to afford quality housing, such as Section 8?
Good point. So, great question. So, the one thing I will claim, I certainly am not going to, and I didn't want to position myself as the housing expert for Lakeville, Salisbury. But generally, the problem is both. It's a supply dynamic. So if you have more units, there are going to be generally more affordable. But you've got, as I said, 50% of the people who rent at below median income, so below the average income are spending more than half their income on rent. And that's not a very sustainable strategy. That includes people with disabilities, seniors on fixed incomes, populations that are extremely low income and vulnerable. The ability to have housing vouchers, which help pay the difference between what someone can afford and what a landlord needs to operate the unit, are the essential solution to people having access to rental housing that exists in communities. And we have not funded that program adequately enough so that only 1 out of 4 people who qualify for it are able to access it. It's not an entitlement program. There was a lot of debate when it was created whether it would be an entitlement program or not, and that was a political compromise. But that is an essential shortage that does create that inability for people to access the housing that's there. Some states have created their own voucher programs to do that supplementally. Both New York City and Massachusetts have additional subsidy programs, for example. But it's also a challenge of, I think, for your community is this a place where a family with kids is going to want to buy because the schools are good and there are jobs that for them here that pay them enough to pay a mortgage, and are the people who are working here, do they make enough to afford even a Habitat for Humanity? Some people may not know that you actually pay a mortgage on a Habitat house. They are not free. And so they're often subsidized greatly by the free labor, but people are still taking on a mortgage. And I think both of those solutions, the ability to add more supply at affordable levels and the subsidies to support people, are both part of it. And the third is the most challenging, which is people generally need to make more money at jobs that we need. And that's a much harder solution to have. And we could have a whole other discussion about that, but that is one of the challenges. This country has seen our housing costs increase dramatically, and I actually had some charts, but I decided not to put them in, which show over the last 40 years, our housing costs have sort of increased on like a 45-degree angle, but our income has largely stayed stagnant with inflation for median income, and that creates this exacerbation, and those solutions aren't easy. Gosh, you guys have lots of questions.
As I look around this audience, I don't see too many young people. Anyway.
Other than me, right?
Yeah, right. First question I have, is there any role for a real estate tax to provide money for affordable housing? The second thing is, what is your take on 401B in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and the pressure it places on towns?
The 40B? Is that 40B? So I'll start with the latter. So, and again, I won't claim to be an expert on 40B. I think for those who don't know, it's essentially the fair share law that towns are required to be providing a share of housing that's affordable to the folks who live there and that median income level. And if they don't, they sort of face penalties, or I guess it's development restrictions and things like that. And there was a point, I guess 2 or maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where there was an effort to roll that back, and it was soundly defeated. And it was a great opportunity to have a public conversation about why we need affordable housing in our communities, which was interesting because people did defeat it pretty handily. But the challenge that we talked about a minute ago, which is having enough subsidy to do it or enough incentive to push developers to do it, is still not being fully met. So I think that, the challenge is the same in that communities are like, yeah, we need more affordable housing, it just should go somewhere else. And that feeling of that frame that people have that it will bring down their property values or that it will be less desirable is still really powerful. And I could give you we could do a 2-day class on the number of studies that have been done about the impact of affordable housing on property values to show you that not one of them has shown a negative impact. It's either had no impact or increased property values, but people still have strong emotional responses to it. I think it's generally a good frame, and it begins a conversation about what to do, but it doesn't solve the problem. But I think it does push people to understand, if we're going to have growth and development in our communities, how do we make sure that some of it's affordable? I think for a community like this, it's probably a little different in that how do we figure out what to do with what we have? I don't think this is a place that's going to see huge amounts of new construction necessarily, but there's clearly some happening. I've driven by some in the last 2 days. But how do we figure out with the land we have, what kind of development do we want to push or incentivize to occur? How do we make use of the small opportunities to increase supply? How do we think about the public land that the city or the county might have access to? Your first question about the real estate tax, generally the best way to increase a fund for affordable housing is through some sort of real estate-driven tax, under the theory as real estate becomes more expensive, that you have a need, the greater the need for affordable housing, and that can help drive it. The challenge is that generally the real estate industry pushes against that strongly because they see it as raising the cost of their product. That's a political debate, but generally the states, Florida, for example, has done the most with that, and it's been successful because every county gets some of that fund. It's over $400 million, and it's been successful, but even there, they still are challenged to find enough supply for their demand. Are we running out of time? Last question. Okay. I'll be available for more questions.
Just an update on that Habitat for Humanity article. This is why we love the Lakeville Journal. We had 15 inquiries about our next house, and we have 5 completed applications. So the need and the people are there. We just have to make sure that they know we're there. Thanks.
That's a great story. Thank you for that. So,
well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming and speaking with us.